And the same thing is happening, with the Gaza hospital strike, in the sense that we've already had over 1,000 kids killed before we even get to the hospital strike, right? We've already had 3,000 casualties before we get to the hospital strike. We had in Caslet and Protective Edge half of the medical infrastructure leveled a second time. We had dozens of ambulances that were explicitly fired upon according to all these human rights reports. We have personnel that was fired upon. We have one hospital that was damaged in 2008. Israel came back and they finally destroyed it in 2014. So we have all that. Nobody's paying attention to it, and nobody's paying attention to it even during the siege. And now it has come to this symbolic, superstitious thing that is like imbued with all this meaning. Who done it? Who done it? Did Israel do it? Did Palestinians do it? And that's going to be, it's kind of like, like a child walking around like, please God, please God, please God, if you do this for me, I promise that I'm going to do this, or I promise I'm going to do that. The same thing is happening. And it's just so laden with superstition and so much meaning beyond, the scope of like really, really what's happening. Because really the big picture, like I always want to bring it back to the big picture conversation. But, in terms of strategy, a lot of it just comes down to, look, we've already said, 1,000 kids have died. You said nothing. We already said over 3,000 died in these other places. Like nothing happened. Maybe something will happen here, right? So.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so these last couple of weeks have been extremely stressful with all the Israel-Palestine stuff going on, the Gaza siege. Most recently, we had the either an airstrike on the Al-Ahli Hospital, Arab Hospital in Gaza, or perhaps it was a failed Palestinian rocket from one of the militant groups. Maybe there's something else going on, but I guess maybe we could start with the Hamas attack earlier in October, and the responses to that, the way that it was framed, perhaps by leftists and those broadly on the pro-Palestinian side, because that's another thing that we're going to talk about. The number of right-wingers that are now just ostensibly pro-Palestine, I think that's very, very new, right? People that you would not expect to be anything other than just pure like pro IDF / BLM types, right? That you not BLM, Blue Lives Matter types that you could find like living out on Long Island, just like a regular old Italian. But yeah, let's maybe start with all of that. Like, did anything surprise you either about the attack or about the way that it was being framed by leftists? Like, did you think that leftists were adequately framing things? Because I feel like many liberals or leftists or whatever, they are pretty uncomfortable discussing terrorism, especially something overt and like civilian massacres like that, right? So, like they're just not very good with words, right? And they're not very good in drilling down to like core ideas, I think, in a lot of these situations. So, what has been your response?
Well, the attack itself was stunning. I mean, it was shocking. It was horrific. I mean, there's no sugarcoating just how horrific some of that stuff was. And I mean, I had a lot of reactions to it, some of which, like even made me a little bit uncomfortable. But I mostly just I was surprised at how audacious it was. I mean, this was really beyond what I thought the Hamas or any armed Palestinian resistance group was capable of mustering against the IDF. Israel-Palestine is an issue that I kind of flit in and out of. I know where my basic moral and political convictions are, but it's honestly so depressing that you just can't follow it all the time or drive yourself crazy, especially because you can't do anything about it. Even getting rid of aid to Israel is not on the table politically in America. So it mostly just makes you feel very, very bad about the world and about things in general. But I just had not realized how deracinated the IDF had become in the last, I guess, 17 or so years since the total cordoning off of the Gaza Strip and the ascension of Hamas. I had not. I mean, I had heard talk about it's become more of a basically a police force that has military arms. It's more of a suppression force. It's not disciplined and well functioning in the way that it historically has been. But to see it thrown into such stark relief like that, to see this group of people with really low, I mean, these people were basically using like paragliders, like parachutes with fan belts on the back of them, to go in and just shoot a bunch of people. I mean, it was, and on no uncertain terms, it's a really hard thing to talk about because it's obviously horrific and it's obviously awful, but there is a difference between saying this is the kind of thing that should not happen in the world, and saying that anybody that does this is like subhuman scum and should be wiped off the face of the planet. I mean, Hamas is a bad group. There's no question that Hamas is a bad group, but it's not inconceivable that a secular, non-genocidal antagonist to Israel could have done something like this. Maybe
I mean,
maybe
they have in the past. I mean, like it's
yeah.
not.
I mean,
it's like literally happened. Yeah.
The specific, I guess, toleration of vengeful violence against civilians might have been less, but the idea of let's go instill fear into Israel by showing that that what they're doing right now really cannot contain us in the way that it hoped. It's totally possible to imagine a secular liberal or leftist opposition group deciding that that was a good investment of resources on their part in order to try and crack this frozen situation open. And I don't think at this point we exactly understand what Hamas wanted out of this. I mean, did they? I mean, they had to have known that Israel was going to respond in basically the way that it has responded. But did they think that they could? Do they feel like they have enough resources in Gaza that an Israeli invasion is something that they can turn into like a Stalingrad type of moment and start turning them back and draining their resources? Were they trying to draw? I mean, the one thing we can say, I think pretty much for sure, is they were trying to sabotage normalization attempts by other Arab states with Israel, especially Saudi Arabia is the one that is most prominently in the news right now. And Israel really has been put on the back foot in terms of trying to, to basically become the hegemon in the region by getting other Arab states to stop caring about what they're doing to the Palestinians and just deal with them as economic and political actors like any other in the region. So clearly they wanted to sabotage that. But beyond that, I mean, it's hard for me to tell if they were a little hubristic about what their capacities were to oppose the IDF, or if they basically knew that this was going to happen and they thought they could spark a larger regional war and create a state of exception whereby they could start, taking parts of the West Bank back from Israeli settlers, or if they thought, or if any other actors in the region had prior knowledge. I mean, they all basically say that they didn't, but of course they would say that, regardless, because that everybody saw what America did to Afghanistan. Tolerating terrorism as a state is no longer acceptable in the in the international community of nations, as they say. So it's
and just so to comment on some of these things. Well, first of all, I should mention that I just uploaded, it was yesterday, I wrote an essay for automachination.com on the hospital attack in Gaza. So I'm just kind of framing it as this, and we're going to talk about this later in this show, but I'm framing it as basically something that quite a few people, but I think especially much more so, it's more applicable to Israel, has very much now hinged their identity upon, in the sense that if ultimately the outcome of who's responsible for the hospital strike breaks against Israel's favor, I think there's going to be just substantial consequences, not so much like for a state, but like just like in terms of what world opinion will be like, what the kind of like self-reflection that maybe Jews might have in America, what that would look like. If you look at just kind of like the wider picture, and I always want to like expand the conversation further out. I mean, like, for instance, like Saudi Arabia pulled out of the normalization agreement with Israel because they knew that, you know, the siege was gonna begin, right? And they did this before we had 3,000 plus Palestinian casualties, over 1,000 of whom are children. And, you know, a hospital strike to me, you know, should not really matter as much as this bigger picture, because if you look at Castlead, if you look at Protective Edge, 2008, 2014, in all these situations, like every time there's a siege of Gaza, literally half of the medical infrastructure is leveled. It happened once, it happened a few years later, and it's probably going to happen again. And this being just like one item out of this whole that we get, I get that, you know, it's like much larger. There's a, you know, there's a much larger like casualty count overall, which is why people are watching. But we really need to like keep the big picture in mind, which is every time that this happens, right, similar things that don't really make the news unless you like you watch human rights reports or whatever and follow those. You're not going to know about them, but it's common. So I talk about all that in the essay. Keith actually, he did submit an essay recently to Automatic Nation, and that's going to be up on Monday. Maybe we could touch on it as well in this conversation too. He's discussing something that he calls asbestos capitalism, the stage of where we are now in capitalism. So we could discuss that in a bit. Just to comment what you said about like the deracinated IDF, one thing that I want to impress upon the viewers who might not know this is it's actually like, for all the jingoistic sort of militaristic propaganda coming out of Israel and the IDF and whatnot, the fact is like the IDF engages military targets like directly, personally, like face to face, far less often than you would think, right? Like, for instance, they're still, you know, thinking like they stopped and they started stop this idea of, you know, are we going to have a ground invasion of Gaza? And there was an appetite for this. There were delays. You had, you know, all these like statements coming out from would-be allies of Israel that, you know, perhaps makes them less confident. Maybe they don't want to deal with Hezbollah in Lebanon because Lebanon would get involved. If there's not Lebanon, but Hezbollah would get involved. If there's a ground invasion, maybe they don't want to deal with that. This is how, honestly, you get a lot of those like 50-1, depending on like which, you know, time you look at it, depending on whatever, you could get death ratios of something like 20 Palestinians for every Israeli, or 50 for every Israeli, or sometimes 100, sometimes 150 for every Israeli death. A lot of that is due to the fact that this is like highly, highly impersonal. These are airstrikes. And it's also kind of propaganda tool because it allows for a little bit of plausible deniability. Because, you know, one thing with the Hamas attack is, especially for like, you know, a liberal like Western audience, you're never going to get them, you know, for the most part. Like, obviously, like I know there's like exceptions and you'll find like students and whatever cheering and whatnot. But generally speaking, most people are just totally turned off by the idea of, you know, close quarters, you know, killing a family, torturing a family.
I mean, that's the
right?
thing that I really don't. I mean, I guess the real thing is just that Palestinians are seen as less human than Israelis on part of Europeans and Americans. But the idea that it is worse to do it with guns and knives,
exactly, that's
and
what I'm getting at. Exactly.
quarters,
Yeah.
that like
Yeah.
I mean, it's not really a morally defensible position. You know,
Yeah, I agree.
it's
I agree 100%.
perhaps a politically defensible
Yes.
position,
Yes.
but it's
It's
not a
political
morally
correctness for the
defensible.
right, you know. It's politically it's just pure political correctness. It's
I
woke
mean, if
bullshit to
anything, I would
say.
say it's in some measure more honorable because at least you're there and you're taking responsibility for it. You know, you're not
And
just
you're getting killed
dropping a
in the
bomb
spot, you
from.
know, like a lot of these militants, they literally get killed, you know, soon after this happened. It's not like they all fled back into Gaza, right? They
Yeah,
were killed in response to this in many of these instances. And yeah, I mean,
yeah,
like that's exactly what I'm getting at. I mean, like that's absolutely true, but it works as propaganda for the IDF because for whatever reason, you know, people think that these highly impersonal airstrikes that killed 3,000 plus people, like in 1 week, right? We had less than 10,000 civilian casualties in Ukraine. The invasion of Ukraine was supposed to be a crime that was only superseded by the 9/11 attacks on America, right? Like it was supposed to be the worst crime since 9/11. We're still under 10,000 civilian casualties. We're definitely like under 1,000, I think, as far as I know. Children probably much under 1,000. And here we have 3,000, right, in like a week and a half. And we have like over 1,000 children in a week and a half. Like and the same people that were doing those condemnations, they're so silent when this is happening, right? It's 100 times the pace of the whatever Russian war crimes are happening.
Well, this is also directly undermining the mission in Ukraine as well. So not only did Biden attach himself to somewhat of a stinker by going all in on the Ukraine thing in the first place, when it appears that neither total Russian victory nor total Ukrainian victory is probably on the table, but it will, and anything that sees Russia either directly annex territory or establish Russian satellite states in the Donbass and other parts of eastern Ukraine will basically be spun as a victory for them. I mean, when that appears at this point to be a more likely outcome than Ukraine totally expunging the Russians from their territory, not only has Biden saddled himself to that, but I was reading this article in the Financial Times where the Western and American support for Israel is directly undermining a year and a half's worth of overtures to countries in the global South that were either on Russia's side or not cleanly on the American side. India, Brazil, Indonesia, places like this. They're just, all they want is some consistency. Like they would like some sign that this talk about the rules-based international order and universal human rights is not just a code word for Western supremacy or for the West violently imposing its geopolitical advantage on the rest of the world and keeping total exploitation of the extractive industries in a lot of these formerly third world countries in place and continuing to reap the advantages of that. And diplomats are so frustrated. I have to read, I'm in this one Discord, and this guy said that he had a drink with a girl who works in the Indonesian embassy as a translator and junior assistant, and she's not there for the confidential or top secret talks, but she hears downtime discussions with people, and she heard one of the diplomats venting, I'll quote this, about how insufferable Israelis are around Palestine. Quote, "We should take into account existential security issues for Israel. Oh, it's a cruel, cruel world. How about Israel just suck it up like everyone else?" And this is I don't know if it's an Indonesian diplomat or an American diplomat at the Indonesian embassy or whatever, but it's just so obvious. It's glaringly obvious that not only has Biden attached himself to something that is probably going to hurt him in the 2024 election by standing up for, and I'm not saying the very idea of standing up for Ukraine is bad, but clearly staking so much of your reputation on your defense of it, it's like such that fucking Matt Gaetz is like flanking you from the left on the question of imperialism is bad, and then directly undermining whatever credibility this might build on the world stage for some sort of renewed American assertion of primacy over defending the rules-based international order. I mean, what the fuck is Biden doing here, man? I mean, I know he's just doing what he's done his entire career and that this all makes perfect sense, but is there nobody in his administration that just like sees these contradictions, that understands that that understood from the beginning that there was like a very tight way that they would have had to thread this needle that didn't include just allowing Israel to indulge its worst, like most paranoid right-wing fantasies and all of this? I mean, it's insane. Where are when we talk about my essay, I mean, we could talk about this, but just where are all the competent people in governance globally? Like, where are the far-sighted people that have like a global understanding of the system and how all the parts link together. Because it seems at this point like they're entirely in China, if they
Hmm.
exist at all, you know? Uh, and so that's why. Uh, I mean, if American hegemony is going to fall, it sure seems like we're fucking asking for it, doesn't it? Like it sure seems like we're just
Yeah, one
inviting
thing
it
I
with
will
our
say
every
is that like
action.
during the Ukraine thing, like it was the first time in a long time that we really tested what it was like in terms of like, all right, what is America's relationship to the rest of the world? Because much of the world did sort of just essentially take the position whether or not America would deny this is irrelevant. That all right, we are essentially now doing this proxy war right between the U.S. and Russia, and we're taking sides. That's the way that it was just kind of perceived, and a large number of countries like India is very kind of reticent to uh, do like open condemnations of Russia. And yet also, I mean, like with Israel now, like I'm not sure if you ever check out India Twitter and how they feel about Palestine, but they are among the best
Well,
agents of
I
Israeli
mean,
diaspora.
if you look at right wing Indian spaces, I mean, they're basically doing
Almost any
Jewish
Indian on
friendship
Twitter, you
about
know what I mean?
Muslims.
Like
So
almost any Indian on Twitter is what I mean. Like it would be like they're primarily at least the small users, maybe not like the big names or whatnot, but the smaller users are always showing up in like IDF tweets and whatever, with like,
thumbs up.
Israeli flag, Indian flag together, right? With like hearts and love,
Yeah,
right?
India with Israel. This
Yeah.
kind of.
Yeah. So we have like that is happening, but yeah, like with the Ukraine war, like I started noticing how fractured it really was, and that's not to say like you can't intellectually know that before the Ukraine war. I mean, like it was always there, but still, like it's true that without an actual event where this gets tested and you see what it looks like in real time, you don't really notice how the propaganda war plays out. You don't really notice how just like the discussion surrounding it play out, the kind of alignments and realignments that are happening all around this. And yeah, I mean, like the US definitely is boxing itself in any number of questions. And many of the Israelis that I speak to, well, not Israel, not even, sorry, not Israelis, Jews that I speak, which is another thing. I mean, a couple, like what one Jewish guy that I speak to, he recently got upset at me when I put up like that video of like Israel lied, like with the Netanyahu face, and he's like, don't you think that's veering a little too close to anti-Semitism? I'm like, no, I'm trying to do the exact opposite. I'm trying to separate Jews from Israel, not say that there's any kind of connection between the two. I am very specific always to say Israeli, but I do sometimes slip up. And guess what? Even though I try to work on that, I blame Israel for it because Israel
Well,
is doing such a heavy-handed job of trying to get every single person and every single Jew in the world to associate Israel with Judaism. They're trying to tell a bunch of random Jews, like New York City Jews that have never been to Israel, right? They have all these emotional attachments to the state of Israel, which did not exist prior to 1967. There were no emotional attachments. That's new. And that's the thing, and that's not even Israel technically in that regard. It's America decides post 1967 war, Israel is useful geopolitically. We're now going to push Israel as the thing that we all defend. It's a symbol of democracy. It's a symbol of humanity compared to the barbarism in the Middle East. And suddenly, all these people that they hate Democrats, they hate Republicans, they still take their marching orders. They still filters down. This is how they behave. Israel is doing such a disservice to Jewish people by associating itself with like, we speak for Jews, we represent Jews, we protect Jews. If we don't exist, you're going to cease to exist. By doing all that, you now associate Judaism with all the shit that a specific nation state does. And I want to be
well,
specific about this is the nation state.
I mean, I mean, it's clear that they're totally like shooting the concept of Judaism in the foot
Mm-hmm.
by doing all this. Because I think there's a new documentary out that's coming out. It's called like Israelism or something like that, and it's basically going to be about how a lot of younger millennial and Zoomer Jewish people in America are awakening to the propaganda and the lies that
Mm-hmm.
Israel has spread about its place in Judaism writ large, and the good and the genocidal threats that it faces and that Judaism faces, and how there really is like some of the most anti-Israel people you will encounter are like American Jews that have kind of woken up about the issue. I went to this, or people that were never pilled in the first place. I went to the Times Square rally and march last week, and there's a group of Hasidic Jewish people that are exceptionally anti-Israel. They're kind of a small-ish sect, but they had their rabbi get up there, and he delivered what I thought was the best and most powerful speech of the entire rally. But he gets up there and he says that Israel is engaged in a 70-year-long rebellion against God, which is like, and I mean, based on what I know of I've always thought that I'm irreligious in as much as anybody is irreligious, which I would say is not as much as we think, honestly, because a lot of secularism is just religion without the God figure at the center of it, but I mean, of the religions, I've always felt, even though I've raised in like a Christian society in a Christian town, like when I just look at the intellectual and theological traditions, the one I feel the most affinity for is Judaism. There's a dialectical and a discursive element to Judaism that I think, and it's there is in some ways like a certain fatalism to Judaism that resonates with me. I'm in some ways not like a very active person in the world and less active than I should be, because I just sort of have well, I guess that's just the way things are kind of attitude that is, partially class-based, partially temperamental, partially whatever, but there is an element of that to Judaism. It's like, you cannot control like the obstacles that God puts in front of you. You cannot control the hardships that the world imposes upon you. You can only deal with it and try to kind of find meaning and community and a sense of connection in spite of these things. So they're really, that's not, of course, not that's obviously a very almost like new agey, a take on it. But I mean, these aspects of Judaism, I find appealing. I feel a pull toward it. And based on what I understand of the religion, which granted is a layperson's understanding, but I haven't done no research, like the idea that Israel is basically a 70-year-long rebellion against God within the tenets of the Jewish faith as it existed prior to the establishment of Israel as a nationalist project is correct.
I mean, I personally never really argue like these like finer theological points, because I know that when it comes to theologians, they will always find a way to like,
I know you can make theology do whatever you want,
always,
but just based on my intuitive gut level reading of it.
Oh yeah, of course.
But moreover, like it's a disservice to people like for whom the Jewish faith really is like something more than an ersatz blood and soil nationalism like you're seeing in Israel. It's a disservice to people that take the biblical aspect very, very seriously. And it's also it's amazing to me that there's not more cautiousness on the part of Zionists and Israeli people about the weird eschatological aspect of Zionism that has been adopted by evangelical right-wing Christians in America, that all of this chaos and all of like basically every time there is some sort of conflict in Israel, there is like probably like 5 to 10% of America that thinks that this is a marker of the coming of the rapture. And they've just completely instrumentalized Jews and Judaism as part of their effectively, like white Christian nationalist project of eschatologically realizing the Armageddon, of apocalypse. So I don't know. Like I said, it's not my place to talk about like the essence of Judaism or whatever, but it like, as somebody who I guess could call himself an admirer of Judaism as a tradition, like maybe in the same way that like the Romans were an admirer of Judaism, as just like I respect something that has cohered and maintained itself for as long as Judaism has, I mean, it's really despicable to see these assholes like taint something that really, like, in my opinion, did have a place in the world, just completely taint it and basically guarantee that unless something turns around very, very quickly and precipitously, like, there's just like Judaism is just not going to be the same as it has been for the last 4,000 years of its existence by, I don't know, 2100 or 2200 or something like that. They've guaranteed that it's going to go down as like this this failed like basically white race, like Judaism is almost defined by being outside of like white Europeanness as it's developed in the last 600 years, and yet it's completely become a project of that.
Mhm.
It's completely become like finding a version of whiteness with which you can potentially economically dominate the Middle East in the same way that like white colonial, like that Europe proper used to do colonially.
Mhm.
And I think we're going to talk about the Edward Said essay at some point here, and he talks about that.
Yeah.
you know
The
and,
morning
and
after. I mean, maybe we could transition to that. Like one thing about, so
yeah.
this is from a London Review of Books, and he wrote this in 1993 after the signing of the Oslo Accords. And yeah, so Edward Said, like I think I read Orientalism in college, but reading this essay, I mean, I always knew his position in Oslo, but I never actually read his essay. And reading this, like, it is very sharp and insightful, and I was surprised by that. And it makes me want to like go back to like his actual, like, the text that he's known for, to see, like what else is in there that might be useful to me, because it is a sharp analysis in different respects. And like one thing, like, okay, so just titling it The Morning After, like one thing that I do miss, like in the age of internet blogs and shit, is like you can't title things just to title them. You have to like worry about, like, well, is anybody going to click on this? Is this going to get picked up by Google? Right. So you have to, like, you always have to do like functional sort of titles, even if it's not clickbaity, they're going to be functional in some way. Here, like, you could, put this in a journal, title it whatever, poetic or half poetic, whether or not it fails, whether or not it works, you have that option. So I sort of miss that. But yeah, like one thing about the Edward Said piece that I think is fascinating is just how like he talks about the propaganda campaign that was ongoing in the 80s versus the 90s, and how it switched, right? Where, and I talked about this before on the channel, but of course, like the PLO, yes, they did engage in terrorism, and in the charter, it did say it explicitly that they're seeking the destruction of Israel. They weren't going to recognize Israel, but in exchange for the possibility of a peace talk, they exchanged, I forget what they were called, articles of mutual recognition, which is if it is called that, it's a misnomer, because Yasser Arafat, like in his articles that he sent to Israel, he had this like long like paragraph. It was like very effusive about, like, we're going to respect Israel, has the right to exist. It should be under international law. And Rabin sent back something that was literally like two lines, like saying, we're gonna sit down and talk, right? It kind of like just whipping that boy into shape, right? We're gonna tell you we're who you are, right? If you want to get a little uppity with us. So first of all, not actual like mutual recognition. And so in the 80s, there was this like propaganda campaign. Arafat is terrible. Arafat is this, that. I obviously didn't live through it because I was not conscious for most of those years. And I was not conscious for most of the 90s either. And I would not have been able to appreciate how the coverage, in fact, changed from the 80s into the 90s, because once Arafat is a team player and he's willing to more or less sign away Palestinian rights in exchange for things that, I mean, like, we could say in hindsight, it was a terrible decision because literally nothing came of it. I forget whether settlement construction was in violation of Oslo specifically, or if it was just in violation of the spirit of Oslo. But settlements like doubled or tripled, within a few years of like trying to implement Oslo. So at a very minimum, right, you're going to have some level of Palestinian resistance and some level of feeling like we've been tricked. But yeah, like once you're able to like sign everything away, once you're able to once you do everything that's asked of you, you become a team player in that regard, media is going to treat you nicely. So that's one aspect of it that I think I underappreciated, not knowing, obviously not being conscious during that time.
Yeah, it's nice, growing up in a pretty right-wing conservative town. It's right below the Wisconsin border, and there like was a even though Illinois was never going to go for Trump, there was a Trump office there because they could do operations up into southern Wisconsin through that office because it was like a 10-minute drive away from the Wisconsin border. And it was Bush country. It always went extremely like for me, I always grew up hearing about Yasser Arafat as a terrorist. He's a
Hmm.
monster. He wants to kill Jewish people. And it's so nice and refreshing to just read an essay that's basically like, no, the problem with Arafat is that he's an egotist, is that
Hmm.
he's a narcissist, that he puts his own political advancement and retrenchment of his place in the Palestinian struggle as like a prominent leader above the actual like interests. Like he refused earlier accords that would have done more for Palestinian rights because it didn't put him at the center of it, and he ends up signing this thing that does nothing, but it at least acknowledges the PLO as the leaders of the Palestinians or whatever, and puts him at the center of Palestinian politics. So it's
Hmm.
it's nice to read a much more grounded take on Arafat than I was raised with in my home milieu.
Hmm. And it also is interesting to read in this essay again,
It's a
1993.
good essay.
Yeah, we
It's
have
really, really sharp political analysis, and it's not,
4,500 words. Anybody
I,
could
I,
read it.
I
I
mean,
suggest you do.
yeah, Said is like kind of lumped in with other postmodern and post-colonial theorists, but I don't know, maybe his theoretical work is more impenetrable and obscurantist, like a lot of that stuff is. But this very straightforward language, very easy to follow, arguments are plain as day, and easy to pick out and either agree with or refute if you so desire to refute it. I mean, it makes you wonder why more of this kind of discourse is not written as clearly as this, when it's like when it is so much more appealing than a lot of that milieu. And I too would like to read a lot of his more like theoretical work, and I hope it's as clear as this, because this essay suggests that he is a good writer to me, at least about politics.
Hmm. And like one thing in the essay that I also, I guess, underappreciated was I didn't know this detail until reading it, but it seems as if there was always this reluctance all around the world to have any kind of census that would include Palestinians within it. Because, and I mean, this is like very apropos now, simply because when you look at what's happening in Gaza, I mean, like I argued this before, right? But this whole concept of Greater Israel, which began a very long time ago. It intensified during the foundation of Israel, this idea that whatever our legal borders are going to be, we're going to always go past them, past them, past them, however far we could get away with such. And this is apparently going as recently as Netanyahu, right? Because he's always saber rattling about annexing the West Bank. He's always he's accelerating settlements, right? He's showing maps where Israel is all of the entire territory, meaning Gaza is part of Israel, West Bank is part of Israel. There's no Palestinians essentially in that world. And like it's very obvious, right? If you just look at the ethnic cleansing from the foundations in 1948 up until now, there is this ethnic cleansing that is ongoing, right? This disappearance of Palestinians. I was just kind of surprised at the level of just extreme enthusiasm that we saw in like if you look at some of the tweets like around the time of the start of the Gaza siege, and you have like all these demands of like opening up a humanitarian corridor where Palestinians could escape, let's say, into Egypt or some other state temporarily while the war dies down. So many of the people there are clearly like really like rabidly pro-Israel, and it's so obvious with even the language that they're using that they want Palestinians to essentially escape into Egypt. The door gets shut behind them forever. And now there are no more Palestinian people, right, within that part of, I guess, Gaza, or that part of Israel, that part of Palestine, whatever. And this is just kind of this ongoing project, right? It's been happening for such a long time. You see direct statements. everyone from Ben Gurion to other leaders, they're always saying the same thing. And the problem is, like, you can't escape from that logic, since if Israel wants to be an ethno state, and people say stuff like, well, it's not technically an ethno state because you do have other nationalities there. That's true, but they also have some sort of cap on how many Jews versus everybody else. Now,
well, yeah, that's total horseshit, because
yeah,
the reason they're an ethno state is because there's a bunch of people that live within basically their borders, their functional sphere of power or whatever, that don't get a vote, that don't get a say basically in what their economy looks like. They are not free to import materials, aid, things like that. It has to go through Israel first and be cataloged and distributed, according to Israel's assessment of what, like, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank or Gaza specifically, need and get. Like, that's, I mean, it's just blatantly apartheid. Like, the fact that there are Palestinians in Israel proper that have the right to vote and have political, or Arabs and Palestinians, I should say, because part of the argument for the ethnic cleansing is this whole, like, well, look at how much look at all this territory of Islam, or you'll get people say, look at all these places where Arabs live, and Israel only has this one little territory. Like, how can you say that they don't deserve it? And it's like, well, I mean, like, different, like Arab is a really broad tent, and the people and like Palestinians, I think, are, like, it's questionable, or at least, like, they're not strictly Arab. They are culturally Arab, but they're not necessarily ethnically, like, derived from the same stock as, like, the people.
I mean, they're clearly different, and they know they know that they're
Palestinians.
Different.
They don't want to be just absorbed into
other places, everybody knows this. That's the other thing,
places.
Everybody knows this, which is why, like, they were so against this idea of, like, a census, right? Because if Palestinians would have any level of, like, self-consciousness, right, some sort of national consciousness, we got Palestinians in Egypt, we got Palestinians in Palestine, we got Palestinians in Lebanon. If they are so self-conscious about this fact, they become, another kind of de facto pressure group. Like, I think, if a lot of this does go down to the fact that, generally speaking, this is more applicable to Israel, but it's also applicable to some degree to other to, like, Arab states, where Palestinians just seem like a total problem to them. Like, they wish that Palestinians would just kind of disappear, because now they have this millstone around their neck, right? Saudi Arabia, and we have to suspend our normalization agreements with Israel. Were supposed to get easier for us. We were supposed to open up new avenues of trade. We were supposed to open up new avenues of military cooperation. But now we're going to have to deal with these goddamn Palestinians again. These, who just don't. That's the thing. I sent you that Egyptian comedian who was on Piers Morgan, right? One thing that he said is, like, they just keep trying to keep Palestinians, and they just never seem to die, right? Which is true, right? They refuse to disappear, and this is a problem. So the best that they could hope for is, if we could just get them absorbed into other Arab states and, like, be happy about it, that's going to be enough. And it kind of, I guess it shouldn't surprise me, but one of the Jews that I was speaking to, and he happens to be, like, a bit more liberal, I guess, in some of the stuff. And I mean, he was telling me stuff like, I was just reading more about the conflict the past week. And one thing that shocked me was, I was, like, just listening to interviews with some of the Hamas militants, and they're 18 years old, 19 years old, 20 years old. And I remember when I was that age and I was a child, and the fact that, they feel compelled to do this, obviously there's something bad going on, and we need to address that. And yet, when we were talking about, like, the Palestinian people in general, he said something like, they could, just get, we could, like, set something up for them where, like, they could go into, like, an Arab nation and live there happily. And it's like, but that's exactly the point. Like whether or not, you feel like,
want to live there.
Like, whether or not you feel like an ethnic cleanser, whether or not you feel like more liberal in this question, you are, like, your instinct, your knee-jerk reaction is they should be absorbed by another state, which, honestly, look, to me, being a cosmopolitan, being someone that wants some sort of like Marxist style, whatever, like centuries from now, that's like, the way that we conduct ourselves. I don't like nationalism. I wish that everybody would just feel themselves as part of the same exact, continuum, and not take these kinds of positions. But A, nationalism is real, and B, the Jewish guy that was saying this to me about Palestinians, he would never ever accept the same thing for Jews. Like, imagine if Jews were told, "Oh, we're gonna deconstruct your state. We're gonna put you here. We're gonna put you there. We're gonna put you there, and you could be absorbed by America. You could be absorbed in Norway. You could be absorbed in France, and that's going to be sufficient. That's going to be enough." They would never accept, such a eventuality for themselves, and because they don't accept it for themselves, why do you expect Arabs to do that? And I think it kind of goes down to what you said. And these are not like psychopaths or even necessarily saying this, but what it comes out to ultimately is Palestinian lives in aggregate, they are worth less individually than individual Israeli lives. You could see this even in like the hostage transfers that have been occurring, right, for decades now. It's always something like, we trade one Israeli hostage for something like, 5, 10, more Palestinian prisoners. That in and of itself, like, you could see what the scale means. Like, literally Palestinian life is less valuable in that regard.
It's just such a difficult problem. I mean, there's the whole world is invested in Israel now, like the whole, yeah, I mean, the success of the state the success of the state just as a state entity for like managing affairs in the Middle East or having an outpost is so directly tied into a lot of these states. And now everyone's like lashed to the yoke of this, like, this ethno-nationalist project. And I do think that we should maybe address, I got into on one of your videos, I got into an argument with this guy who, I mean, he really annoyed me, and I strongly disliked his arguments. But I think it's probably, if not, I don't know if strongest is the word, but the most honest and straightforward and difficult to refute, because it rests on different priors argument, which is like what Israel has done, what the Zionists have done, is not especially different to what basically any other nation state in history has done, to what any other polity has done, which is like take a piece of land, decide on like a series of cultural signifiers and a norm of language use that you will call your nationality, and just impose it and impose it and impose it until the previously existing heterogeneity of that particular area of land basically goes away. And it's not like, it's not world historically evil what Israel has done. It's just regular evil, but more recently. And so and
yeah, where we have like that's I think the critical difference. We're able to observe in real time this happening. Like the idea of like groups of people like literally being disappeared, either through ethnic cleansing, through like massacres, or whether it's like, okay, we're just gonna force you out and you get absorbed among everybody else. Like, that's been going on forever, but we're witnessing it. We're able to comment on it. We have historical examples that collectively everybody, including Israelis, decided, yeah, the massacring and genocide of Native Americans was wrong. And yet here, right, we have the same application, same ideas, not willing to use the same exact standards you would use for anything else. And saying that, like, that's, I think, the main difference. We see it.
Well, and that, that argument, I mean, like, it's ultimately irrefutable in the sense that the priors that it rests on are morally felt. It's not true or false. It's just like a theory about the world and about the human and about how the mind works and how politics works, that like the idea that this is basically just the way humans are. It's the way that politics is structured. There's nothing you can do about it. And it's anti-Semitic to say that it's worse when the Jews do it, which I mean, I could even like almost grant that last point. Like, there is a certain, I don't know, there's like two strains of anti-Semitism, which is like classical style anti-Semitism, like, oh, they're rootless cosmopolitans, they they take advantage of people. They're hucksters. They destroy countries if you let them have too strong of a foothold. And there's like Middle Eastern style anti-Semitism, which is like, fuck those guys. Look at what they're doing to the Palestinians,
Yeah.
you know? And those two streams, like
That's like
they
mainstream.
cross each other, and they take advantage, like they opportunistically take advantage of each other,
Yeah.
you know? But what I'm worried about is, I mean, I do think, you know, with the, you know, the only useful things that Joe Biden has contributed to my life has been a modest amount of funding for climate stuff in America. You know, and people say, "Oh, you really think Biden's better than Trump?" Yeah, because I got climate stuff from him that I would not have gotten from Trump. So I'll take my victories where I can get them, even if it's wildly insufficient. But also the phrase semi-fascism, which is really just the most like accurate and correct assessment of like what the right, because it's not fascism. It doesn't look
Mhm.
like the way that right-wing politics functioned in the early to mid 20th century, but it's like clearly related to and descended from it, you know,
Mhm.
and it's clearly, or at the very least, it's converging on similar conclusions. And to see the like response to this Israel shit in the last week, like there is like a growing semi-fascism, like even within Democratic Party that is supposed to be the bulwark against it, you know, like John Fetterman was supposed to be this example of how to do populist right-wing appealing politics without, you know, strongly compromising on various social values that we hold as Democrats. But hey, maybe we can get the big mechanic looking guys with jorts and Jinko hoodies like on board with us if we have more people like that. But he's like putting himself out in front of like criticizing the squad for their like fairly like milquetoast and uncontroversial statements
Mhm.
that Israel should not mistreat Gazans, you know, because of what Hamas did here.
You know what
You
it reminds
know,
me of? Like, there's something about this where it's like APAC seems to be like the fucking NRA for
yes,
liberals, in the sense that, like, you know, whenever you have you know, some sort of like massacre in America, like using, you know, either legal or illegal weapons or whatever it might be, you know, all these liberals, they come out, right? They say like, we, you know, we need to make these reforms, we need to make the following changes, whereas the conservatives are like, I am shocked to hear this. I'm very unfortunate events. Let us pray about this. We need to deal with mental health issues, blah, 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 right? And when it comes, they make the same statements. The liberals make the same statements when you have, like, so far, we're up to like, okay, over 1,000 children killed in the Gaza strikes. It's all, we need to pray for
yeah,
Gaza. It's all, I am shocked to hear this. It's all, this is bad. It's all, but it's never ceasefire, right? It's never, these are structurally the things we need to do to prevent this from ever happening again. I mean, look, anytime that a president comes into power, they can, if they so desire, right? Putting APAC aside, putting the pressure lobbies aside, putting aside whether or not they actually have the votes for that, there is a set of steps that they could take to like literally prevent like any terrorist attack, right, happening in Israel, which would include the construction of some sort of you know, credible Palestinian state. Like one of the most amazing things about all this is just how, like, you know, like we need to talk about Netanyahu. I mean, this is within like a,
psychopath. He is a psychopath.
he's
He is a sociopath. He is
he's a
nuts.
psychopath. Like he's one of these people that should have been just totally, you know, in the dustbin of history, like after the original war on terror. I mean, like I retweeted something recently where he was basically giving, like, during like the start of the war on terror, he was giving all this advice to America, and it, you know, eventually amounted to like, you know, what you guys are doing is absolutely right, and you have to double down, you have to go harder and harder and harder on you know, obliterating terrorism. It's not going to lead to the formation of groups like ISIS. What are you talking about? Don't worry. So I mean, he's one of these like George Bush figures that should not be in the conversation anymore, and yet he, you know, he makes his way back. He's essentially a dictator now, and within Israel there is a conversation that's happening, right, in terms of like, you know, there is an existential risk to his government, to Netanyahu himself, in the sense that we have information now, like literally verbatim quotes from 2019, where he's telling his cabinet, we have to fund Hamas, which includes direct cash transfers, because it is the counterbalance to Fatah. And if we manage this counterbalance, that will make Hamas more powerful. There is no threat of the emergence of a Palestinian state from Fatah. okay, look, if that's what you want to do because you believe that this is this is your cost benefit analysis, fine. But do not say that a terrorist attack with 1,300 plus casualties is not your responsibility. It is your responsibility. You made that calculation. You said from the very beginning, Hamas is a terrorist group. We cannot support terrorists. This is an existential threat to us.
This was inherently built into the accounting.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Everybody knows this, and all the people now they're saying Hamas is that's the new thing. They don't even say Hamas is ISIS; they say worse than ISIS. If you believe that Hamas is worse than ISIS, if that is the fact on the ground, then you have to take responsibility for that. Calculation includes the possibility, if not probability. That's the other thing. I wouldn't say possibility. Let's be real. Probability. It's going to happen eventually. Palestinians don't have a state. There's nothing going on in the last few years other than passive sort of support of ethnic cleansing. There's very limited Palestinian resistance until I would say the last year or so, and then you had this like explosion more recently. But generally speaking, nothing is happening in that in the West Bank, right? There's no state, there's no discussion of this. Things are getting more and more apartheid-esque. Conditions are getting worse and worse. Before even the question of Hamas comes up, hundreds of people have already been killed in the West Bank, right, over the last a year or two. A bunch of kids, like dozens of kids, have been killed in the West Bank, right, in 2023. And those are not on the news, no pictures of them. You don't know their names. You don't know what they were doing. All the people that would say, oh, they were doing something naughty and they deserved it. Okay, well, let's talk about these individual incidents of the murder of children. Can you even tell me what the context was? What were they doing? What's the controversy? What is the IDF statement? They don't know any of that. They're just taking it at face value. So you're going to get not a possibility, a probability of a terrorist attack. It came. You're going to have to take some responsibility for the fact that you were funding this group since the 80s. In the morning after, Edward Said, to my surprise, he mentions Hamas and he mentions Islamic Jihad, right? Two groups within Palestine. He's talking about them in 1993. For whatever reason, they're still part of the conversation now. They're made to be part of the conversation. That's the fascinating part. Like in 2006, it's very possible we could have had a democratic outcome in Palestine simply because you had a democratic election. Nobody contested it. Hamas won. And immediately you have a blockade. So they're not going to respond to that blockade, and they're not going to respond to non-recognition the world over by saying, okay, well, we did it democratically. We're not going to resist. They're going to start amping up attacks. They're going to start doing the things that you say that they shouldn't be doing. There's not going to be any more elections. That's the other thing. If you believe democracy in Palestine is so important, but by intensifying that blockade, which by the way already was there, you are foreclosing the possibility of a democratic future in Palestine. And that's the thing, like, this is the frustrating thing. Like, Palestinians are so much more secular and have so many more democratic instincts than most of the Middle East, than most of the allies of Israel in the Arab world. One Jew that I know, when I talk about this, like, he was, like, a couple of years ago, he was so proud of, like, Saudi Arabia becoming, more and more an ally of Israel. I'm like, really? Like, literally, these are like your friends. Like, that's the thing. Like, everybody's like becoming more right wing, more religious.
That's my fear, is that just Israel is the test case for this sort of like generalized, like semi-fascist kind of approach where the theoretical existence of democracy and human rights in certain countries will be the pretext by which they legitimate their subjugation of other countries, and other peoples. Like the fact, like if if America needs to, do more to assert hegemony over Latin America as the climate breaks down, and you're having to, get more and more stuff from elsewhere and blah blah blah. Then the fact that these governments are all corrupt. They're not real democracies. They don't have real elections. Or there's so much questionable stuff happening. That's going to be, obviously, like Russia and Ukraine, and having somewhat of a valid point with Euromaidan maybe having been a false flag, according to your former guest Ivan Kachanovsky. That this is just going to, this discourse of democracy and human rights and secularism and things like that is just going to be like the justification for like whatever is in the 20th century the equivalent of what fascism was in the 21st century, you know, this like this legitimating discourse by which disposable peoples, as our friend Dan said in the comments of your previous video, the discourse by which disposable peoples are put in a position to be disposed of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maybe we could talk about some maybe like the Gaza hospital stuff explicitly before maybe some conversation on your essay, and switching over to the patron show. We're just going to continue everything that we're talking about now. We're going to have more details on that after the fact. But one thing about the Gaza hospital strike is, you know, there's two things happening at once, and both of them are out of either necessity or perceived necessity. So on the one hand, and I mean, you mentioned this to me, right, where you were like, oh, you know, there is something disrespectful about the number of, you know, people that are like pro-Palestine that, you know, maybe are just kind of like against further investigation because they feel like, all right, what if this isn't going to break in our direction? Meaning like, oh, you know, Israel is the one that did the airstrike and it is responsible for the destruction of the hospital. And I mean, I do agree with that. At the same time, right, there's also this thing where they feel wedded to it on some level, right? Because it's very similar to the George Floyd stuff. I remember talking to like people that I know about George Floyd in 2020, and the way that I phrased it was just, if you look at the fact that everything that's been going on in Black America is like really like under the hood, people don't really notice it because neighborhoods are segregated. You know, it's not happening to me, right? People aren't dying around me. I don't have to grow up with like, I mean, like, it's just kind of crazy how you go to like any, you know, given like, you know, all Black or majority Black high school and like whatever, like city setting or whatnot, you know, so many like literal kids there, right? We're talking about teenagers have friends that are just dead, right? And they're dead because of murder of some sort. That's not an experience that many, you know, or most white people in America have, right? It's just, it's just not going to be part of their lives. And because of the segregation, like, it's easy to neglect all that. So it finally takes something like, all right, if you're not going to listen to us when we talk about the wealth gap, if you think slavery is no longer relevant, if you believe that police brutality isn't real or it's not a big deal, if you don't believe that just like general police, like street harassment, which never ever makes it to any statistics ever, if you believe that's not relevant, the only thing we have left is like literally our physical bodies, which is, okay, we're going to catch one of these cops murdering someone on camera in a way that is like totally undeniable. And maybe that's going to be enough to, like, if not do something about it, at least cause an uproar, at least have people talk about it, whether it's cynical or not. Like, at least there's going to be something in the air, right, related to everything that we've been talking about. And that's just kind of how it's been, right? I mean, look, you could go through like so many Black neighborhoods now. You're going to see homeless people. You're going to see people asleep in their own piss. You're going to see all this kind of shit. But like, you put that in a poster somewhere, you put that in a video, people would either ignore it or they would laugh at it. But if you have this video of a murder, maybe something's going to happen, right? So there is this kind of like odd martyrdom that it's not willing, right? It's just like forced, right? No one's signing up for this, but that's just kind of how things end up playing out. And the same thing is happening, you know, with the Gaza hospital strike, in the sense that we've already had over 1,000 kids killed before we even get to the hospital strike, right? We've already had 3,000 casualties before we get to the hospital strike. We had in Castlet and Protective Edge half of the medical infrastructure leveled a second time. We had dozens of ambulances that were explicitly fired upon according to all these human rights reports. We have personnel that was fired upon. We have one hospital that was damaged in 2008. Israel came back and they finally destroyed it in 2014. So we have all that. Nobody's paying attention to it, and nobody's paying attention to it even during the siege. And now it has come to this symbolic, superstitious thing that is like imbued with all this meaning. Who done it? Who done it? Did Israel do it? Did Palestinians do it? And that's going to be, it's kind of like, you know, like a child walking around like, please God, please God, please God, if you do this for me, I promise that I'm going to do this, or I promise I'm going to do that. The same thing is happening, and it's just so laden with superstition and so much meaning beyond the scope of like really what's happening, because really the big picture, like I always want to bring it back to the big picture conversation. But in terms of strategy, a lot of it just comes down to, look, we've already said 1,000 kids have died. You said nothing. We already said over 3,000 died in these other places. Like nothing happened. Maybe something will happen here, right? So, but on the other hand, like Israelis are now so like, this is now, I think, so critical to their identities. Like it does really feel like with all this like buildup going down. Like first of all, like Israel has already like maybe half of the goodwill they accumulated after the Hamas massacres has been already sort of like kiboshed. But it like this other part of it, it feels like if the evidence ultimately, again, it's Thursday the 19th. I know that the U.S. said that we have evidence, well, but I don't, I'm not going to take this stuff seriously until like, we got to see something real. We have to see some kind of assessment. We have to see some investigation results. Like that's just how anything like this should work. But if the evidence does break against Israel's favor, it feels like almost as if like the country's going to like vaporize before our eyes. It feels like they're going to disappear, like in some ways. Like it's very odd.
I do understand the symbolic importance of this. I mean, and the material importance, of course. I mean, it's the hundreds of people dying in an instant. I mean, we have to know what happened here. I mean, I think the thing that kind of gets me though is I do think this is sort of I mean, so much of discourse is predicated on this idea that if people just knew what was really happening, then it would change. I mean, if Israel did something this abject and this craven, then maybe it would finally crack things open and things would start swinging in the direction that we want it to happen. Maybe you would, and maybe it's the case that you would have less civilian support of Israel if they just nakedly bombed a parking lot full of hundreds of
I think that's refugees. A huge part of it too. Yeah, I think that's a big part.
But I don't think it would actually change the geopolitical calculus of the situation all that much, because the countries that are on Israel's side, they're pretty pot committed at this point. I mean, like America is certain. I mean, America, most of all, certainly not going to withdraw support of Israel away because something like this happened. I mean, because they've never done it before. It's not like this is the first time that Israel has. I mean, Shireen Abu Akleh, I think I might have gotten her name wrong there, but she's an American citizen, and she got murked by Israel,
literally murdered, directly targeted. Yeah, and CNN released, and that's a shocking part. I did not expect CNN of all places to release the sort of like tell-all analysis of the fact that yes, she was a journalist, an American citizen that was explicitly targeted by the IDF for being a journalist in that area, and that's just kind of how it went. And this is another crazy part. Like, think about it: there are nation states out there that, because of geopolitical strategy, if you as a citizen, as an American, are going to go over to some of these places and they like straight up execute you and don't hold anybody accountable, the U.S. is not going to do anything for you or your family. They're not going to release statements. They're not going to demand some sort of investigation. They're not going to demand some sort of like criminal justice. They're not going to do anything at all, right? They will just move on as if it didn't happen. I mean, we saw that. Grant, he wasn't a citizen, but he was a permanent resident. The Khashoggi murder, right, in Turkey by Saudi Arabia. We saw it happen.
We do too,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we do the same, a little bit differently, granted, but still, yeah.
But like WikiLeaks released a video of like American guys in a helicopter just like murking, a whole group of people, whether they were enemy combatants or civilians is like unclear, but just like yucking it up, as they like machine gun like hordes of people from a helicopter, some of which were pretty like established as civilians. So like the reason like America can't condemn this, because to condemn this would be to condemn ourselves, to impeach our like the base. I mean, it just basically becomes a utilitarian. I mean, like if Israel gets implicated in this, it's just going to become a utilitarian analysis. Like it's a tragedy that this happened. We'll have to, whatever was the field commander that made, because I don't think that this was like done from on high, like if this
No,
was the
it's just
Israelis.
someone behaving like an insane
Yeah, it
person,
was.
and there's no
Yeah, yeah,
consequences. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Like we'll have to hold this field commander accountable or something like that. But to say that this was a predictable and perhaps almost inevitable consequence of the way that the conflict itself
Mhm.
is structured in the first place is to say that that basically everything that America does is on the world stage is like practically unjustifiable,
Mhm.
so that's why, I mean, ultimately, I completely agree that this follows a consistent pattern of behavior that Israel has engaged in the past, to deny responsibility until people care less, and then they can
Mhm.
kind of come out and say, upon further analysis, we realized that this actually might have been us. We're very sorry. We didn't mean to. Please,
It's
I mean,
crazy how that
yeah,
happened also with the 2018 Gaza protests, where it's like we literally
yeah,
had hundreds of mostly civilians that were just straight up massacred. They
yeah,
specifically targeted that 20 or 21-year-old girl that was this like medic. And not only
yeah,
did they explicitly target her, this is what I talked about in the essay, and murder her, like a sniper, like literally. They then released like doctored, like selectively like edited footage that made it seem as if she was saying that she was a willing human shield for Hamas, and that was like taken from like some, I don't know, like a Lebanese or something, like TV interview from like months before, and she was not saying that at all. It was totally, it was not that idea
yeah,
at all. What she was saying was that, as a medical professional, I'm gonna be there. There's gonna be a line of fire. I might get killed. That's not saying that you're being set
yeah.
out. Like
And
it's
just
like
to,
stuff like that. They did it themselves. They did it themselves, and that's another thing. Like whatever way that the airstrike in the hospital breaks, like you have to at least concede that the propaganda campaign coming out of Israel, it is so imbecilic. I mean, like, first of all, one of that guys, the guy that's like the mouthpiece for Netanyahu, there's like videos of them like hugging, and Netanyahu says, "This man, he works for me, produces
he
media
spoke at his
content."
wedding. He
Yeah,
spoke at this
they're very
Naftali.
close.
Yeah,
He's a Netanyahu mouthpiece. As soon as the
yeah,
strike occurs in the hospital, he tweets out, there has been an Israeli strike in the hospital that was done
yeah,
because there was a terror cell within the hospital, and the reason why we did it is because there were weapons, there were militants, and isn't it the way he said, it's heartbreaking that Hamas continues to use human
yeah,
shields and
yeah,
causes this destruction, right? They literally said that. Then the IDF says, "Oh, we have proof that no, it wasn't us, it was somebody else. Here's the video," and it's a video that's dated 40 minutes after the strike. Look, I'm sorry, but if you feel miffed that people prejudged you after you level all the medical infrastructure once, twice, did a bunch of damage already. There's already 20 medical facilities that were destroyed prior in this siege alone in the past 2 weeks,
hmm,
prior to this hospital being destroyed. If you feel prejudged, you better stop being fucking sloppy. You better stop saying that you're going to commit war crimes right before you start committing any number of war crimes, of which this might be one, just one out of many, many, right? Like this, this all like falls back on your shoulders in these ways.
yeah. Well, and the thing I was going to say earlier is, the thing that I would caution against is that the 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 pro-Palestinian side does not rest on Israel having been culpable and responsible in the hospital bombing. Like
Of course, exactly,
there's no
100%.
there's no reason to over invest in Israel guilt and culpability here,
Hmm.
because it does look embarrassing for your side if you go so hard on that and then the ultimate investigation like ends up. I mean, weird things do happen in life. I mean, like the fog of war is real and something that you have to take seriously, especially as an amateur watching like cell phone videos that people are taking and drone footage and shit like that. Like there's no, like, the fact that this fits Israel's pattern. I mean, like, that's a solid heuristic, but it's just a heuristic.
Hmm.
It's not determinative.
Yeah.
So, but where I think the useful point in all of this is the fact that the first impulse of somebody attached to the Israeli propaganda apparatus was to take credit for it and to
Hmm.
say, "Oh, we were right to do it. This was
Yeah,
perfectly
exactly.
justified."
And it's the same
That's
justification as
that's the
always.
point of entry to normal people. It's not look
Yeah.
at this horrible thing that Israel did. It's look at this. The like doing horrible things is already like it's pre-digested by them. It is like they have already built in justifications for something that may turn out to be horrible if they do it. It is like just like when you think about trying to justify Israel and make excuses for them, consider that like if this had been them, they would have made excuses for it. Like they publicly showed that like out in the open. So like the ways that they try to justify it and say, oh, it was human shields, oh, there was munitions there, oh, it was this, oh, that was that, maybe apply a little more scrutiny to when they say these things in the future, because like even if they weren't culpable, the fact that they were willing to take credit for it and say that they were right to do it tells you something about the Israeli moral position in this phenomenon in the first place. And I think that is more effective at winning hearts and minds than like insisting that it has to have been Israel, because like I mean, I spent like 2 days like deep in this like OSINT shit that people are doing, like, and it's really not clear to me. Like, it really does seem like more damage and more death than a Palestinian rocket is typically capable of inflicting, but less damage and like uncharacteristic damage of Israeli munitions. It's the kind of thing that is almost there to drive online sleuths crazy. And maybe Palestinians, like maybe Islamic Jihad was not bullshitting when they said they had the Batter 4 rockets. Maybe maybe this was an Israeli munition and it just exploded in like an unorthodox way. You don't know. We don't know. The only way to really prove this shit is to have somebody go in with like swabs and test for like chemical residues and really.
And that's the thing. Israel would never, ever, 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 ever allow that to happen. If you start coming in, like if the UN decides to come in with some fucking swabs, they're gonna get vaporized. No way. The best that you could get is you have the US releasing a statement. Our intelligence suggests blah blah blah, and of course they don't release it, right? So I'm waiting for some kind of release. I'm waiting for some kind of leak. And I mean, to your point, there is this kind of like odd in between state where there's definitely, I think, evidence of both sides. Like some of the people that I know, as well as like people online, they're definitely right now, like Israel is like, running victory laps. Like, yeah, look what the US said. Yeah, it's confirmed. But it's like, okay, well, first of all, this actually is not consistent with like typical rocket fire from from Hamas or like whatever. It's also not entirely consistent with IDF strikes. But then again, there are IDF munitions that they've used even in this siege that does not necessarily cause a lot of damage, but doesn't necessarily cause a crater. There's the fact that right now, like I wasn't talking about this stuff like publicly or like even with people because there was no real confirmation. It was just like tweets or whatever. But the people it's under the auspices of some sort of a Baptist group, right? Because it's like, I think it's like a Christian hospital, right? So it's run by some kind of Christian group. And there was like for the last 2 days, like there's like these tweets coming out like, oh, they're saying now that they received all these phone calls that you have to evacuate this hospital because we're going to strike it, or we're going to strike like right in the vicinity or like whatever. And now, like I just before we sat down, I was just checking to see like some updates, and there's now you see like these like old men that are clearly like like old clergy or whatever from the church. Like I didn't watch it yet, so don't take it as gospel, but I will watch it after the show, where they're like sitting down some kind of press conference or whatever, like indicating like, yes, this is what the IDF told us, and soon after that there was this thing that occurred. So it now becomes this like weird state where it's like, well, if the IDF did say that they were going to do the strike, now you have like the possibility of a preemptive thing happening from a militant group, which is like, well, you can't say that Israel would be totally absolved in that situation, even if they did not do the strike, as like in the sense of like, look, if there was no Hamas that you propped up, right, and there was a Palestinian state, there would not be a situation where you're in Gaza and maximizing the chances of either intentional or unintentional things going haywire, right? That's just kind of like the basic line. The same with that when we look at something like, the murder of Trayvon Martin, one of the egregious things is like, yeah, I mean, Zimmerman did go out of his way to follow him. He did go out of his way to actively put himself in a situation where honestly, he should just like not be. Right. You should not be in these situations because things could spiral out of control, and either you're going to get killed or someone else is going to get killed. And if you're the one doing the killing, that does not mean that you don't have to think about it ever again, right? There is guilt, right? There is, you were in a bad situation. So there's always this like effect of maximization. We're always maximizing the chances of something crazy happening. And this is just like one. And I want to just stress again and again to people watching this, one hospital, especially with as many casualties, is bad, but focus on the slow asphyxiation. Thousands of people have already been killed. This hospital is a small fraction of the total. It's a small fraction of the total of children. It's going to be an ever smaller, diminishing fraction of the whole as time goes on. Keep that in mind. This is not like hinging your identity on this. Like, let Israel do that. Let Israel hinge its identity in this whole thing. If it wants to like vaporize itself, if it breaks in the wrong direction, let them do it, right? Palestinians don't have to do that. But again, I totally understand the inclination to want it to be that way, not only from the perspective of like it's symbolic and important, but also, like if the IDF is responsible, I feel like the ground offensive is off, right? If it becomes definitive that, this is the way that it happened, the Arab states that you signed this normalization agreements with, they're not going to back you. The U.S. might have to pull back some funding, right? Things are going to start to spiral out of control in that way. You've already delayed the ground offensive a couple of times. This will be, the nail in the coffin in that. So, like even from a strategic standpoint, I can understand just in terms of like, let's have a ceasefire right away. Let's minimize casualties. Obviously, from that perspective, Israel being responsible is better in that regard, right? If you want to use that kind of terminology, right? It does minimize casualties going forward.
I will agree with that, yeah. But and then supposedly Biden, I read, I think it was the Times out of England that said that Biden had sort of privately given his approval to Netanyahu for a ground invasion. So it's certainly, I mean, they have delayed it, but it seems like they just can't. They can only delay for so long, or especially with this unity cabinet and what was his name, Gantz. He's not really any better than Netanyahu.
Yeah, all these people are such psychopaths.
He's less overtly genocidal and megalomaniacal than Netanyahu, but he's basically the same guy, just not with a bunch of corruption charges attached to him.
I love it when like Jews or Israelis are like, I'm not a supporter of Netanyahu, but it's like, what are you talking about? There's literally nothing else. That's the thing. Like Netanyahu is so, and I wonder if there's a lesson for this in America in terms of a possible future for us, where Netanyahu is so inevitable. The right-wing shift, the kind of crazy images that we've been seeing the last 2 years of just like random Palestinians getting beat up, spat upon, kids getting murdered, settlers, just like so many videos of just settlers like with like automatic weapons, point blank, an unarmed Palestinian getting shot, right? Because they're having some kind of argument. The police forces come over and they support, right, the guy doing the shooting. Almost no punishments ever for anything like this. This is what we've been seeing. And this feels like so inevitable, because if you foreclose the possibility of like a Palestinian state, remember Ariel Sharon, when he pulled out of Gaza, right? One of his stated explicit reasons for, pulling out of Gaza was, if we eliminate the Gaza occupation, which of course is also a misnomer, because I mean, there's still a blockade, there's still like some level of control over Gaza. It's not a functional state. There's still a kind of even like legally speaking, you can make the case perhaps that it's an occupation. But he said, we're going to pull out of Gaza because if we do that, watch. There's not going to be any more discussion of a Palestinian state. And that turned out to be true. There was no more discussion of a Palestinian state after Camp David, after Taba. That was it. Any other two-state peace plans, they were always just total jokes, right? They were always stupid. They were always non-starters for literally everybody involved. So
they were a distraction.
Yeah. Like how many people talk about they still talk about the Olmert two-state solution, which is like, if you read the terms, it's like the West Bank is like split up into like 80 districts and Israel still controls the motion. Like, what are you talking about? This is not a state. right? Like, and nobody wants to talk about those kinds of details. And I mean, this like right wing drift. Like, okay, so if you have this population on your borders and you want to pretend they don't exist, you're gonna have a right wing drift in your country. It's gonna get more religious because suddenly young Jews, they don't care about this. Cosmopolitans, they're like, what is this weird fucking country that says that it speaks for me? And eventually things get crazier and crazier. And it is kind of telling that the biggest protests, it seems like in Israeli history, have been specifically about Netanyahu's corruptions and abuses of power. They had nothing to do with Palestine. Maybe, you had Palestinian flags there. Maybe there were some people, there were like in human rights groups and whatnot that work in this kind of stuff. But generally speaking, they were not about, right, Palestine and Palestinians, right? They're not. And that's another part of it, right? Like the Palestinians have ceased to be part of the Israeli imagination, which is another reason why you had this kind of attack, right? Now it's like, well, oh shit, Gaza exists. These people exist. They're still in those conditions that they were always in. Nothing, by the way, has actually changed, right? That's another reason why you have an attack.
Yeah, and just to go back to like the rightward ratchet, where now even the left opposition in Israel is basically the same as Netanyahu in terms of its posture toward the Palestinians, its lack of taking their self-determination and rights seriously. I mean, it's just, I mean, I think the thing that gets anti-Semitic is when people start framing this as like Israel is in the driver's seat in the Israel-America relationship. But no, this is
No, America is.
No, it's all downstream of, and you see the same rightward drift in American politics. I mean, going from Reagan and Bush to Clinton, suddenly welfare reform becomes a Democratic principle and not a Republican principle. The idea that there's a lot of people taking advantage of welfare, that we have to redesign it to make sure that they don't do that, becomes a tenet of Democrat politics. And then you get the Bush administration and the war on terror and the surveillance state. And then you get Obama in power, and he's not quite as brutal as Bush in terms of the war on terror stuff, but he's doing the drone war shit. He expands the surveillance state instead of curtailing it. And then you get Trump, and you get this like this renewed sense of like nationalistic hostility toward other countries, the ratcheting up of tension with China. People called Trump a Russian stooge, but there was absolutely a ratcheting up of tension with Russia under Trump as well, with the arming of Ukraine and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, the war
tariffs,
has its roots there.
The border enforcement, and like now you have Biden, and all these Republicans are hyperventilating about how far left the Democrats have gone, and the Flight 93 election, and what was that, 2016 or whatever. But like Biden has really only rhetorically moved away from the policies of the Trump administration. I mean, he doesn't have a different policy on COVID,
Not a different policy on China. He's just inherited the policy and went with it. And I remember I was arguing with people about this. They were like especially some of the right wingers I know, they were insistent that Biden would get into office and he would go soft in China. I'm like, what are you talking about? I was like, he's just going to follow exactly what he was doing because the radical party sets the agenda. Biden's going to continue. He continued Trump's Ukraine policy. Like he's just doing what Trump was doing.
And this is where you just have to, I mean, I don't call myself a Marxist. I think that tradition is just too cursed at this point, and there's too many blind spots and holes in it. But I do kind of call myself like a historical materialist, I guess, if you want to say that that's the discipline that like Marxism was the inauguration of or whatever. And you have to put your materialist hat on and say that this is not about the specific whims or moral content of any particular politician or any particular president or anything like that. These are exigencies that are being dealt with. And if you're coming at it from a liberal point of view, and both Democrats and Republicans are liberals in the philosophical sense, in the classical, belief in markets and the individual as the proper like unit of analysis of social and economic policy and things like that. And if that's where you're coming from, then you're going to converge on common solutions, and if you're dealing with the same exigencies, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans, then there's like only so much wiggle room that you have in terms of what kinds of policies you can pursue if you're starting from the same frame of reference. So I mean, you can get mad at Biden. I'm certainly mad about. I'm not fucking voting for him in 2024. I mean, I don't. I mean, at this point, like Trump was more entertaining, at least. Like we're like the policy is not better enough under Biden to continue empowering the Democratic Party, and it's like complete chokehold on the conditions of possibility of progress or whatever. What I that's a problematic word, but whatever you want to call it. But you also you can criticize him, but you can't like it's not. Biden is not uniquely ill-equipped to handle this situation. Like whether it's Trump, Biden, Pete Buttigieg, Kamala Harris, Gretchen Whitmer, fucking Vivek Ramaswamy as Dark Horse, like whoever it is, like they're all going to converge on basically the same solutions because they're all starting from the same poison paradigm in the first place. So, and it's the same thing. It's and what as America goes, so goes Israel. So as the options that are open to liberal politicians in America just come to look more and more like fucking Barry Goldwater conservatism and austerity and things like that. So the options that are open to Israeli politicians, whether right or left, quote unquote, are going to look more and more just like Netanyahuism. It's going to like the backsliding from the policy that Netanyahu has cultivated in his term of policy in his term of power is going to be rhetorical. It's not going to be meaningfully material because this, like the reason like he's a psycho, but I mean, like even psychos have their reasons for doing things, and the thing that you're responding to in the first place has not gone away just because you voted a liberal party into power. So
well, let's actually close it here and continue our conversation on the patron show. This was nice and substantive and hefty. Again, I have an essay right now on automachination.com where I just had to get this off my chest in a sense. Like I did a bunch of videos recently and I'm doing this, but I needed to do a piece of writing, right? That's like, tight, crafted, gets at something that's, that's going to remain like substantive for a long time, right? No matter how this ultimately plays out, the hospital strike, whatever the outcome is, I put enough stuff in there within just like 1,500 words to try to make it just as condensed as possible. There's enough stuff in there that I think is going to reverberate further and further out, irrespective of the outcome. And that feels like a big load off of me. Like I feel like I have to communicate with the writing in some way. Videos just don't cut it, right? Videos are, it's a separate category altogether. And again, Keith is going to have an essay on his concept of asbestos capitalism. That's going to be up a few days after this video is up. So thank you guys for watching, and for the patrons, stick around and we will continue our discussion there.